Basking in the sun's warm embrace, Lissa laughed like a young girl without concern for the curious glances of passers-by. She intended to share the wonderful news with her husband. The pregnancy test had displayed a clear positive result. Right by the building's entrance, she noticed a homeless man who, too, was relishing the sunlight, humming a cheerful tune. He seemed to be celebrating the end of winter, which allowed him to stay out of the cold basement until the next chill. As Lisa reached for the intercom key, she was ready to unlock the door when the homeless man suddenly sprang up and drew near. Her heart skipped a beat, her life seemingly flashing before her eyes, imagining the worst. But instead, the homeless man broke into a warm smile and handed her a bouquet of dandelions, saying, "This is for you, madam." Lisa was touched by the gesture and replied, "Thank you, sir," as she took the dandelions. After closing the door behind her, Lisa leaned against the wall and couldn't help but chuckle. An ordinary homeless man had given her flowers, and she was elated. It made her realize how long it had been since her husband had made such thoughtful gestures. Placing her hand on her belly, Lisa whispered to herself, "It's just you and me now." Well, here goes nothing. I'm out to share the good news that would send him rushing to the flower shop. Lisa inserted the key into the apartment door and burst in, calling out, "Darling, I'm home. Come and greet me." But all that answered was eerie silence. Lisa peered from the hallway into the living room, not finding her husband there. She sighed, realizing that Jakey was probably held up at work again, and it was likely to be very late when he arrived. She scolded herself for not informing him of her plans. Seated in a chair, Lisa contemplated her need to schedule an appointment with the gynecologist. She wanted to discuss the prospects of preserving the pregnancy. Worries crept in about failing to inform the child, especially when her sister had just become a mother for the third time. Lisa couldn't help but fret about heredity, even though she knew that genetic anomalies weren't always passed from one family member to another. Just as she was lost in her thoughts, her phone rang. Lisa activated the speakerphone and heard Barbara's voice. "Hi, friend, are you busy? Can I come over, or will your Jake be upset?" Lisa let out a heavy sigh, her voice filled with melancholy as she replied, "Yes, no, he's delayed again, and it's unlikely he'll be home in the next few hours. I won't even bother calling him. I don't want to distract him, especially if he's there for surgery. It wouldn't be right for his wife to suddenly demand all his attention when he's so occupied." After a brief pause, Barbara added, "That's true, but I have a feeling there's more on your mind. All right, in half an hour, I'll bring the liqueur. We need to unwind a little." Lisa contemplated telling her friend that she wanted to decline the alcohol, but before she could speak, Barbara had already hung up. Barbara arrived with a sense of urgency, almost as if there were a timer attached to her feet. She sat down in a chair and stated, "I'm all ears. Share your thoughts. By the way, what's the story with that bouquet?" Lisa had managed to find a vase and place the dandelions in it, clarifying, "It's just some random man who gave me this bouquet. He was sitting near the entrance, a bit shabby looking, but he seemed quite intelligent." Barbara wagged her finger at Lisa and chuckled, "Your husband might not take too kindly to this. You'll have to explain the bouquet to him later. I know your Jakey well, and it's safe to say he probably won't even notice that vase." The friend's observation held some truth, as Jake hadn't been paying much attention to Lisa lately. He was deeply engrossed in his work, saving lives. Every time Lisa attempted to engage him in a serious conversation, while fetching glasses from the cupboard, Jake would brush it off by saying, "Not now." Barbara winked and suggested, "Let's have a drink to lift your spirits. You're kind of a downer at the moment." However, Lisa placed her hand over the glass and replied, "No, I can't. I suspect I'm pregnant, my cycle is delayed, and the test left no room for doubt. Tomorrow, I'm going to see a doctor. The sooner everyone knows, the better." When Barbara whistled and nearly toppled off her chair, Lisa was taken aback. "Really? Come on now. Who delivers such news with a gloomy face? Let's hear that phrase again," but with a smile. Lisa couldn't manage a smile and shook her head. "Okay, I'll try it, but don't delay seeing the doctor. That's what your Jake, a surgeon, not a gynecologist, would say. You wouldn't want to wait in line forever." Barbara contemplated for a moment and then inquired, "Why are you so upset? I always thought pregnancy brought happiness and smiles into a home." Lisa struggled to hold back tears as she replied, "Well, if it were a long-awaited pregnancy. If he isn't against it, and honestly I have no idea how Jakey will react to this, because he never planned for me to get pregnant. He seems to live in a world where there's no room for a child." Barbara placed her hands on Lisa's shoulders and spoke gently, "Don't be sad, my friend. Everything will be all right. I'm sure of it. I know your husband will be overjoyed." The guest's assumption was incorrect, because Jakey not only had no plans for having children in the near future, but had no intention of having offspring at all. However, neither Barbara nor Lisa were aware of this. After daydreaming about happy motherhood while chatting with her friend for another hour, Barbara began preparing to leave. She said, "All right, I'll head home. Don't be afraid to have that conversation with Jake. See how he reacts. Anything can happen in a family, including the birth of a child, so stay strong and don't let it sour you." Lisa, who had received a positive energy boost from her friend, felt inspired and began waiting for her husband to return from work. Jake finally arrived around 1 in the morning and attempted to sneak into the kitchen quietly to avoid waking anyone. However, Lisa was ready for his return and loudly called out from the bedroom, "I'm not asleep, dear, and I've been waiting for you to have a serious conversation." Noticing the dandelions, Jake made his way to the vase and said, "Good night, my love. I'm sorry, but I had several difficult patients today, and I couldn't leave work early. By the way, what's with the flowers in the house?" Lisa didn't dare to mention the homeless man, so she replied vaguely, "I picked them myself. I wanted to bring a touch of fresh air into our home." As Jakey sat down on the edge of the bed, he inquired, "So, what kind of conversation am I in for?" "I want something serious." Lisa pulled back the blanket and got out of bed, saying, "Honey, we're going to be parents soon." "I'm pregnant," Lisa said, reaching out to her husband for a hug, but he strangely evaded her. "Wait a minute, didn't you take your birth control pills? We've already had this conversation, and I thought you understood perfectly well that now is not the time for children. You need to get firmly on your feet, and only then consider having offspring." Tilting her head to one side, Lisa replied sadly, "Well, yes, your career in the hospital mean everything to you, and it seems like our relationship falling apart doesn't bother you." Jake tried to calm her down, but Lisa just shrugged and headed into the bathroom, where she spent almost an hour crying quietly to avoid letting her husband hear. Tears flowed from her eyes ceaselessly, and even splashing water on her face couldn't soothe her. Instead, it made her want to cry even more. She couldn't believe her husband's insensitivity to the news of her pregnancy. She had hoped for joyful exclamations and strong hugs, but none came. Her anger towards Jake grew, and she was on the verge of confronting him. Barely restraining her emotions, Lisa left the bathroom and lay down on the sofa. Her husband seemed to understand but didn't call her in. He left the bedroom in the morning as quietly as the previous day, without breakfast or a cheerful greeting. Lisa endured it, knowing that her relationship was falling apart, and feeling hurt by Jake's indifference. "I'm pregnant," Lisa said, trying to hug her husband, but he strangely avoided her embrace. "Wait a minute, haven't you been taking your birth control pills? We've had this discussion before, and I thought you realized that now is not the time for children. You need to get back on your feet, and then you need to think about procreation. Besides, I've got the head of the department coming up. It's a career move, and I don't want to give it up." Ducking her head to the side, Lisa replied sadly, "Yeah, that's right. Only the hospital and career are more important to you, and the fact that our relationship is falling apart is not to your liking." Jake tried to reassure her, but Lisa only shrugged and headed for the bathroom, where she spent almost an hour crying quietly so her husband wouldn't hear. The tears flowed unceasingly. Lisa tried to wet her face with water, but it didn't help. On the contrary, it only increased her desire to cry. Her anger at Jake was growing inside her, and she wanted to tell him everything to his face, barely containing her emotions. She returned from the bathroom and lay down on the couch. Her husband realized it was best not to call her into the bedroom. In the morning, he left just as quietly, not even having breakfast or wishing her a good day. Lisa accepted it, realizing. Lisa tried to reassure herself that there was no need to be nervous about her upcoming visit to the gynecologist. She was firmly convinced that she would bring a child into the world, and she didn't care much about her husband's reaction. As she left her building, she encountered the same homeless man again. He greeted her with a low bow, and perhaps the kindest words she had heard in days. "Good morning, mademoiselle. What wonderful weather for lifting your spirits." Lisa felt her heart melt at his polite words, momentarily forgetting about her husband at home. She nodded in response and wished the gallant man a nice day. If any of her neighbors had witnessed this encounter, they might have thought she had lost her mind. Her mood remained clouded by her husband's indifference. He hadn't even asked about her pregnancy term or how she was feeling. It was only at the gynecologist's office that Lisa found out she was 4 weeks pregnant. The doctor reassured her, noting that the child had excellent health. There was no reason to worry, and she could happily share the news with her spouse. Lisa felt relieved and anticipated her husband's positive reaction. Filled with joy, she called a taxi and headed to his workplace. However, her smile quickly faded as she saw her husband embracing a curvaceous nurse by the hospital entrance. They were engaged in an animated conversation, and Lisa was tempted to confront them right then and there. However, the taxi driver wisely advised against it, suggesting she wait until her husband came home to have a calm and private discussion instead of creating a public scene. She realized he was right and decided not to act hastily, thanking him for the advice. Lisa grumbled in dissatisfaction and took the advice to heart. She called for a taxi and asked to be taken back home. Within 20 minutes, she was back at her place, nervously fidgeting with her fingers as she processed what she had witnessed. She couldn't comprehend how her husband could do this to her. On the way home, Lisa noticed that Jakey had kissed the nurse. She couldn't afford to let her nerves boil over to a breaking point. Once back home, Lisa couldn't contain her emotions any longer. She broke down, tears streaming like a river, her shoulders trembling in rhythm with her sobs. When her husband returned from work that evening, she confronted him. "How do you justify this, Jakey? You're hugging and kissing another woman, and you don't even seem to care that she's your coworker." In response, her spouse retorted, "It's none of your business what I do there. I don't inquire about your daily activities. Who gave you the right to spy on me?" Lisa recoiled, then quickly retorted, "Yes, because you've developed the habit of coming home late at night. Sometimes you don't even return until morning. Furthermore, when I told you about my pregnancy, you didn't show any happiness. You know, Jake, I haven't told my parents yet, and I should probably inform my father first. If he gets wind of your antics, he'll take matters into his own hands, and that won't be in your favor. If you're serious with that nurse, it might be better if we get a divorce. I'll raise our child on my own." After those words, Jake's demeanor took a drastic turn. He sat down in a chair and placed his hand. He started looking around nervously, fully aware that Lisa wasn't joking about her father. Her father, Konstantin Petrovich, was a retired military man who had seen action in Afghanistan and later served for many years in the city's police force. He was widely known and respected, and some even feared him. Konstantin was stern and didn't tolerate any disrespect. But when it came to his beloved daughter, he was willing to move mountains. Jake feared him, having heard stories of how Lisa's father dealt with serious issues. In the end, Lisa's husband yielded. "I'm sorry, my dear. It's my fault that I let my guard down and flirted with someone. But you must also understand that there's tension between us, and it's becoming increasingly challenging for me to communicate with you." Lisa couldn't believe that Jakey could skillfully evade responsibility and shift the blame. Jake seemed to express deep remorse, behaving like a contrite child as he tried to persuade her. Remembering her friend's advice, Lisa responded, "No, Jake, you reacted negatively to my pregnancy. I'd rather live alone than suffer with you. I suggest you consider where you'll live with this nurse, and I'm not joking. I won't share my husband with another woman." With that, Jake abruptly stood up, put on his jacket, and slammed the door as he left the apartment. Lisa had no doubt that her husband had gone to meet his mistress. If she were aware of his actions, she would have been concerned for her own safety. To keep out of harm's way, she chose not to disclose anything to her parents, especially her father, who was capable of taking extreme measures to settle such matters. Lisa hoped that her husband would come to his senses and end the affair with the nurse. She didn't intend to lose him permanently, as they had spent 7 years together. While it might not be an exceptionally long time, they had shared a reasonably happy life. However, something had fractured in recent months, and Lisa was now fully aware of the cause. Yet, she wasn't ready to give up or put an end to their marriage, which would necessitate a complete change in her future. She felt unprepared for such a drastic shift, both emotionally and physically. Another troubling thought was having to explain to their child in the future why they didn't have a father and who was responsible for that. Suddenly, she felt a desire to take a walk, hoping to dispel the prevailing gloom. Lisa exited her apartment and descended the stairs. The street was already dark, and the streetlights had yet to illuminate the area. As she passed the dumpsters, she noticed the familiar homeless man and waved to him. He responded with a polite nod. As Lisa turned the corner, she felt a sudden, sharp pain in her neck. She lost consciousness, and what followed was a blur. Eva was moved to an unknown location, and the only witness to the incident was the homeless man. Apparently, the kidnappers didn't pay him any mind. The homeless man, with his keen eyes, noticed a crucial detail that ended up saving Lisa's life. When she woke up, she found herself in an unfamiliar cold place that appeared to be a morgue, with freezers nearby. She was lying on a metal table in a corridor. Voices could be heard nearby, and Lisa, feeling disoriented, rose to her feet and stumbled. Lisa was gripped by fear, and her body tensed up when she recognized her husband's voice. She began to realize the dreadful fate they were planning for her. It was a horrifying revelation. Lissa knew she needed to find a way out of this perilous situation. But then a sudden wave of nausea washed over her. Peeking out into the corridor, Lissa was horrified to see Jake handing money to a pathologist. It could mean only one thing. Her husband had betrayed her and was plotting to dispose of her, pregnancy be damned. Lissa's thoughts were a chaotic jumble in her head, but she desperately tried to formulate a plan. The only option left was to run. Gathering the last remnants of her strength, Lissa opened the door and sprinted down the corridor, glancing back to see Jake and his accomplice. Jake noticed her escape and shouted anxiously, "I told you we needed a higher dose." Her legs felt as if they were dragging heavy weights. Lissa knew she couldn't outrun them. Suddenly, there was a loud crash, as if someone had fallen or been intentionally pushed. Lissa kept running until she was caught and her shoulders were grabbed. At that moment, her heart nearly stopped. Then a voice, identifying itself as Mademoiselle, rang out, assuring her that there was no more danger. She turned around to find the same homeless man and her husband lying on the floor some distance away. The pathologist, meanwhile, cowered in a corner, trembling like a leaf, his hand still clutching the baton that the homeless man had used. Lissa noticed that her savior had the baton in his hand, likely the same one that had incapacitated Jakey. As she slid down the wall, relief washed over her, and she let out a sob. The homeless man extended his hand towards her and introduced himself as Victor. He then suggested, "Just in case, let's leave this place." But Lissa was not ready to depart without taking action. She knew she needed to find a phone to contact the police. Victor agreed to this and made sure the pathologist didn't attempt an escape. Soon enough, not only the police but also representatives from the prosecutor's office and the investigative committee arrived at the morgue. Jake, after being awakened and coming to his senses, was taken into custody. It turned out that Lissa had been fortunate, as the dose of the drug administered to her wasn't strong enough to cause complete paralysis. This meant she woke up in time to avert a grim fate. Had she remained unconscious, she would have been hastily sent to the crematorium, and Jake planned to file a missing persons report after her supposed disappearance. But Lissa emerged victorious from this ordeal.